Welcome to FO Talks. With me is David Mahon from Beijing. He is a seasoned investor and analyst of China. Today we are going to discuss a very important visit. Xi Jinping went to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. Apparently, this was an important visit. David, welcome. Give us some context of this visit.
It's a very important visit. It's the first time in 7 years that Xi has been there. And also it marks a change in North Korea's positioning generally. It's hard to know when it began to change, but certainly the support of Russia in the war with Ukraine was a very important step. First of all, supplying the ammunition, of which Korea has huge resources, but also sending soldiers. So that link to the world is very uncommon given North Korea's long Hermit history. So visits to Korea, Pyongyang by Putin and now by Xi Jinping show that North Korea is getting a more open acknowledgement of the two countries, but also I would argue will be more likely to be more closely managed in a way by both countries, something that was not possible in the past. The big myth was Pyongyang did exactly what it wanted, except China would call it to account when it suited China. China had no control over North Korea, not for a very long time, not for 20 years. It's been appalled at the intercontinental ballistic missile construction, the nuclear tests. So Korea basically distanced itself from China, even hated what China had done with its economic reforms, seeing it as a betrayal of the version of communism, although I don't think communism applies to North Korea myself, but that's the language that's used. So this visit is an important step. It's interesting that it took place around the time of the strikes on Tehran from the United States and Israel. Those things are important. Are they linked? I don't know. There's some conspiracy theories here that it was a statement. I'm not sure of that. I don't think China goes in for that sort of those blatant gestures.
So let me stop you for just a second. A lot of our viewers, a lot of people listening to us right now do not really understand North Korea. All they know is that this is a country that is somewhere in Asia, fires off missiles every now and then, scares South Korea and Japan, and some would hold that it's a puppet of China. That's may be true, may not be true. The more important thing for our viewers and listeners to learn is what exactly is the backstory of North Korea. There was the Korean War in 1953, and thereafter North Korea has had the Kim Dynasty in charge, but paint us a brighter picture, a fuller picture with more color of North Korea from, say, 1953 to now.
I'd like to go back, if I may, to actually the 6th century, because there's a simple narrative. It's one that relates very directly to China. The Tang Dynasty tried to invade and manage the whole of the Korean Peninsula. There is a myth China never invades anybody. It is true they very seldom invade anybody, and issue Korean or Vietnamese. But in this case, they tried very hard, and this is the peak of the Tang Dynasty, to subjugate what were 3 major principalities that made up the Korean Peninsula. In the end, they had a couple of generations of managing things somewhat, but then one of those that had allied with them to defeat the others and help them to win their position turned on them, having used them effectively to defeat their adversaries. So then there was one prevailing dynasty afterwards, which is a very interesting history in itself. So after that, although Korea was very good at dealing with China, this term paying tribute, which I think in English is rather misleading, It's a more complex thing to go and visit a more powerful country and have a dialogue with it. Paying tribute sounds like you're kowtowing and being in obeisance all the time. It's not like that. It's more nuanced. There's more mutual dignity involved. But the real thing, I think, which tracks through to today is the extraordinary Joseon dynasty, which began around 1400 and ended around 1910. And it's one family. I mean, 500 years. This is as long as the Roman Empire. This is longer than any Chinese dynasty ever lasted. And one ruling royal family, effectively.
And the Romanovs were there for 300 years in Russia. So they beat the Romanovs by 2 centuries.
That's true. They beat the Romanovs. Good point. I think also the whole culture of Korea has been influenced by this extraordinary continuity. And the fact that the royal family and within the Joseon dynasty were attributed miracles and great qualities. They were the sons of heaven in a real sense within the thinking of the people. And when we hear that Kim Jong-il played golf each morning and he got 18 holes in one, there are things back in time when similar remarkable abilities are granted to the emperors of the Joseon dynasty. I think Kim Jong-il also was supposed to have written, I forget what it was, something like 200 novels while he was at university. I remember sitting with a friend and trying to work out how that was possible. And I think it was something like a novel every 72 hours or something. But that tradition has come through to almost, let's say, the elevated status of the current ruling family, the Kims, and the acceptance of the fact that one family will rule. Because the gap between feudal imperial Korea was very short. You had the Russo-Japanese War. You had a major defeat with the Sino-Japanese War. You had a whole mess around the Peninsula of Korea. Was one of the main targets, one of the main aims of those conflicts. Who would control the peninsula? So somewhere between
and then
1900...
we are talking of the Sino-Japanese War is 1904, 1905. So we are talking of just over a century ago. And then, of course, the Sino-Japanese War kicks off arguably in the 1930s. Although the Japanese are there on the mainland before they get Shandong after the Treaty of Versailles. So they already have a foothold. But all of this kicks off in the turbulent first half of the 20th century.
So by 1910, Japan annexes Korea effectively, and the American Navy was behind that. They chaperoned the process. Around the same time, Taiwan was drawn into the Japanese Empire. So there was no breathing space from a imperial Korea that was entire and had its continuity of culture and its integrity of territory. The turn of the 19th century into the 20th century had this huge upheaval, and the result was the Japanese Empire expanded into Korea and held it until 1945. And during that time, it subjugated Korea brutally. I mean, if we look at Japanese atrocities through the Pacific, Burma, we look at them through Asia, China particularly, Korea suffered just as much as anyone else. And the Americans, in their ineptitude, once they liberated Korea in 1945, they basically reinstated the collaborators with the Japanese regime amongst the Korean population, and even used some units of the Japanese army to help them enforce the peace, the aftermath. So the Koreans have got a pretty jaundiced view of a number of things in terms of outside forces and imperial forces. Pretty jaundiced view of China. They certainly have no time for the Japanese. And there was this very tense situation that led, of course, to the outbreak of war in 1950, which led to 1953. And during that war, if we think too of what the world was doing, it's a bit like what America is doing currently through Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. Or one would argue Russia's engaged itself too in Ukraine as a proxy to struggle with Europe and NATO. The Korean War was a struggle with the Soviet Union. The history is mixed. If you look at the detail, both sides were violating a number of positions that had been agreed, but there was a rough north-south divide. It was the Russians, though, that instigated the sweep down to the south, taking of Seoul, and the commencement of the Korean War as we know it. The Chinese weren't involved. And in the end, the Chinese were brought in, of course, and they were successful in driving the Americans back to the 38th parallel. And the interesting is, that was the first war America lost after the Second World War. They drove to the north, they divided their forces, they didn't listen to the intelligence that the Indian and Pakistani embassy was sharing with them in Beijing at the time. It was a very tense situation, but there was good intelligence the Chinese were going to join. So you have the war, you end up with a divide, and North Korea is in a state of armistice, ceasefire. This war is still active. Following that, the isolation of the Cold War left North Korea in a very poor state. It doesn't have many resources. The north is very mountainous. There's not a lot of arable land. The population, they think it's 40 million. When I was in North Korea, that was the view they had, because that's what they're told. It's actually closer to 25, 26 million, from what I understand. So it's a small population, but they don't have enough land to feed themselves. Rice is the main, is the staple, which is spiced with a few things, but it's a very isolated economy, and one that China has also not made a big fuss about trying to release. You know, China's been part of the containment of Korea, along with the United Nations sanctions and those other partners, because of the development of nuclear weapons in Korea. So it's a country that has no understanding of the rest of the world. There is no internet connection with the rest of the world. There's no way they can do anything. They may watch South Korean films if they can rig something up to receive them, and that does happen. But the penalties for doing so are very strict, are very severe. So we have a very isolated country that at the end of the Korean War is left dependent upon the Soviet Union and dependent upon China. Unlike South Korea, China pulled out of North Korea within 3 to 4 years, didn't leave any troops there at all. The Americans left their troops in South Korea. So China looked at the situation and thought, unification is not a good thing now, because it would bring America to our borders. So they have supported the division of the Koreas for their own strategic interest. But at very few stages have they influenced Pyongyang or the Kim family. So this trip is important, because it's one where we now sense that there is influence, and Kim is obliged to listen to both Putin and Xi.
So that's a very good point. I just want to draw attention to the fact that North Korea is known as the Hermit Kingdom. North Korea has been an economic basket case. You alluded to it. Very little of the land is arable. North Korea hasn't quite industrialized. The heavy industry they have is usually used to make weapons. North Koreans are 3 to 5 inches shorter than their South Korean counterparts. That is 7 to 13 centimeters shorter. Of course, they have very similar genetics. So this is entirely because of nutrition. So in a nutshell, North Korea hasn't quite been very successful as a state. And it has been isolated. The Kim family has ruled pretty much like medieval monarchs, as you have alluded. My question to you is, So far, they managed to plow their lonely furrow in isolation. Now, you say both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping are trying to exert control in Pyongyang. The question is why, and why now?
It's a combination of reasons, and I'm only assuming what those might be. One is quite clear if you look at the declarations of both Communist Party meetings. There is now a support for a Korea that is not seeking reunification. And China has acknowledged that change in policy in Pyongyang. That's a major step. And the fact that China is acknowledging a North Korean policy in itself shows a deeper level of engagement. And let's remember 90% of the Korean economy depends on China. It depends on China for most staples, oil, grain. A friend of mine was involved in the dispatch of aid to North Korea, trains carrying grain and oil into the main railway station in Pyongyang. They were met, they were thanked, and then the crews of the trains were driven back to the border. North Korea kept the trains. You know, there's a desperation in that country. I was there 10 years ago. The city of Pyongyang, everyone looks fine. They eat well, they seem pretty buoyant, nice apartments. Once you get into the countryside, it's a different picture. People are much, much thinner. Farming is intense. I think the only thing that resembled any industrial revolution was a bicycle leaning against the fence of a field as I watched a farmer plough that field. Perhaps the steel blade on the wooden frame behind the bullocks. I also watched, as we drove to the DMZ, or the DMZ as the Americans call it, and stayed a night halfway down. And you can't wander around. There's always people looking after you. Extremely friendly. I mean, people are very welcoming. And at no stage did I feel unsafe in any way. The courtesy, the dignity of the North Koreans is very impressive. But I heard the siren, and it was the end of a shift at a brickworks. And workers came out of the brickworks with bicycles. And no one mounted their bicycle. There was a sort of incline. It wasn't a steep incline, but it was an incline. I thought, that makes sense, you know. People do that. You wait till you get to the flat. As they came up the incline onto the road, that was flat across the fields. They just kept walking. And it was clear they were too tired to cycle. The food we were served outside of Pyongyang was rice with a kind of sauce. It's a bit like flying on British Airways, chicken or the fish, you can't tell which. And it was supposed to be the protein. So it really kind of struck me that while trying their best to serve us as guests, even their best was pretty lean. So this is a country that's isolation has costed hugely. And I think we can say what a terrible country. They fought a war which it was terribly costly in terms of human life. We can say that in their isolation, their building of munitions to threaten the rest of the world has been a great fear factor. But we forget the West has not really tried to resolve the issues of North Korea. They have not tried to work with China to resolve the issues of North Korea. If any American president had the humility to say to President Xi, for instance, or his predecessors, let's do this together. Let's just both go to Pyongyang and talk. Let's see how we can resolve this economically, how we can resolve the security anxiety of North Korea, which it is most justified in having. Ukraine got rid of its nuclear weapons. Look what happened to it. Gaddafi got rid of his nuclear weapons. Look what happened to him. You know, this rules-based order, supposedly run by nice Christian people in the West, is nothing of the kind. It's power, it's economy, it's capitalism, and in North Korea's case, its isolation has been invested in by the West. And people will say Clinton tried and Obama tried and there was some aid. And I think they were sincere in their motives. But a comprehensive approach could do a lot to begin to release the country from the bondage that it's not only inflicted upon itself, but the West and those around North Korea have helped tighten the bonds. You look at North Korean people and you get the same feeling as you get in Seoul. These are strong people. These people have stamina. They're intelligent people. Give them any opportunity, they'll succeed. You know, South Korea is a great success story. So it's a mixed bag. You know, nothing takes away from the human rights abuses. We know what has happened. We have glimpses from dissidents and other sources on how brutal the regime is and how repressive. Everything is directed towards its military and its military elite. And one could argue it's still a feudal country. I would argue it's a theocratic feudal country. There are statues everywhere of the young leader and his father and grandfather. I was in this military museum, extraordinary building, a marvelous museum. Chinese participation in the Korean War is one room and a couple of dioramas. Everything otherwise says they want it on their own. But you walk into the main hall and there are two huge statues, one of Kim Jong-un and one of Kim Jong-il. And the people I was with, the North Koreans, all bowed. And it's a bit like my first time in a Hindu temple. When I knew nothing about Hinduism, I bowed too, because you bow with those you're with. And they were bowing in a real sense. So that factor is interesting, that sense of almost the divinity of the family that rules them. But there is a way, and I think collaborating properly with China, what remains of the West and its power, and that seems to be slipping away by the month as we talk, there is a way out of North Korea's isolation.
David, let me take you back to my question. Why and why now? Why are Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin showing up? Is it because Vladimir Putin is using North Korean troops? Is it because he wants to deepen military relationships with North Korea, with Pyongyang? Why Xi Jinping? Is it because China fears North Korea slipping into the Russian arc of influence? Is there a Sino-Russian rivalry jostling for power going on in Pyongyang? Is the young Kim playing off Russia against China and vice versa? So I'd like you to give us more context as to why these visits now.
Russia's initial relationship or expansion of its relationship with North Korea to buy ammunition was simply that, as far as I can see. I don't think Russia's had any wish to be more deeply involved in North Korea for a long time, for decades, because everything about that relationship has been bad. I mean, if you can't predict the actions of your friends or your partners or those on your borders, it's very difficult to have a proper relationship with them. So I think initially it was that. And then I think Russia saw an opportunity that they could do more than that. And they could perhaps lessen the risk that North Korea posed to them as well, because North Korea fighting anybody is going to hurt everyone that borders them. And I think in the same almost circumstantial manner, the Chinese government saw what the Russians were doing in sourcing ammunition and later troops from North Korea. And let's remember that Russia is an economic suzerain of China. I'm not saying it's some imperial asset or a colony, but it's an economic suzerain. So the strong hand and the power in this relationship is Beijing. So any struggle, any kind of competition for influence in Pyongyang, I think would be very slight. China's not interested in that. China's very good at not competing where it doesn't really either understand what the outcome would be or need it. China's biggest issue here is to recover the land taken away from it along the Pacific coast, which is now coastal Russia, Vladivostok being the main city. At some point, China will have that back. by negotiation, by investment, by any means it can. I think China's only interested in making sure that the good relationship with Putin becomes a partnership of managing Pyongyang as best they can. They don't need North Korea. They don't need it for military purposes. China doesn't, contrary to the Western myth, have a strategic alliance with North Korea. They have a treaty. It's only a few pages long. It was signed in 1953-54, which says they'll look after each other if attacked. That's it. Whatever North Korea does, China won't be its ally. Let's say it sent missiles to Japan or it attacked Seoul. So I think it's almost by circumstance, both countries have taken the opportunity to have a more open discussion with a country that's a problem to them both.
So you've mentioned the problem, and the problem is real. North Korea is a nuclear power. North Korea has fired missiles. In fact, the rate of the firing of missiles has increased. It has been a nuisance to South Korea and to Japan. There is increasingly a feeling that as Portly Kim ages, there isn't a clear successor, and the North Korean state is unlikely to last as long as, say, the Joseon Dynasty, or for that matter, the Romanovs. So there's a belief that this is a state that is a troublesome state, which has, of course, the insurance of nuclear weapons. But fundamentally, economically, this is a state without a future, and this is a state that has to be contained. So is the aggression of North Korea now a problem for China? And is it a problem even for Russia?
It's long been a problem. I mean, there's no way that Russia and China had any time for the extent of the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea. It's documented, China expressed its displeasure directly to Pyongyang. And it's also aware that if North Korea wanted to take South Korea, it wouldn't need nuclear weapons. The 38th parallel is so close to Seoul, a few hours of what it seems North Korea has in conventional artillery would basically destroy much of Seoul. So, it's a situation where the problem of North Korea is it doesn't really need the nuclear weapons for its defense in any reasonable territorial sense, but it's more having nuclear weapons that it could drop on California or Washington or Alaska. That's what it now feels will give it its security. And let's be objective and understand any country in this age would say, yeah, if I've got a nuclear weapon, I'm not going to be destroyed by the United States. Because the United States has been destroying countries that didn't have nuclear weapons. And I think it's now become the insurance policy that it didn't have to be. I mean, stepping out of nuclear weapons agreements, talking as a nuclear power, as America has, on the basis that it intended to upgrade its systems. All this is very much in the hands of the incumbent nuclear powers. Russia has a lot to answer for in this sphere as well. It's not just at the feet of the West. So, who's going to tell Kim Jong-un there's an alternative to his nuclear weapons? Because we know that once you give them up, you're basically screwed. Ukraine once had nuclear weapons. They gave them up. And now, they're a battleground. They're a proxy for a number of things. So, to see the future is very difficult. And I don't know the future. And succession, frankly, the question of succession, as you put it, has been asked at each succession because the North Koreans are very opaque about the process. For a while, it seemed that Kim Jong-un's sister looked to be a prominent candidate. She's still in the mix, but it seems now that his daughter, who is an adolescent, is a prominent candidate.
That'll be a major, if I can just stop you, that'll be a major shift because this is a patriarchal society. This is a feudal society. This has been a society where men have led for centuries. And now the two people talked about as successors are women. This is a massive shift.
It is a massive shift. But remember, Kim Jong-un studied in Switzerland. He looks older than he is because he's a heavy man. But
you're being kind. I mean, some would say he's a fat man.
I think if you wish to call him that at all, you can call him that.
I'm not. Some do call him a chubby fellow.
He's a chubby bloke. That's true.
And the photographs seem to suggest that they have a point.
And I think when we look at his grandparents, his father, and what we know about obesity, of course, his life may not be very long. It's a lot of pressure on the heart. It's a lot of stress on many things. So, but he is already a much younger generation and someone that didn't come from war and revolution. His life was privileged. He was educated in a private school in Switzerland. He didn't travel around Europe a lot. What I understand, most of his time was in his residence, playing computer games and enjoying himself, and maybe just being isolated because of who he was. It may not have been his choice, but I'm not trying to infer that.
The Hermit Prince of the Hermit Kingdom. The Hermit Prince of the Hermit Kingdom in the mountainous idyll of Europe.
So he's someone that is of another generation. He's shown extraordinary acumen, taking over power from his father and taking over power that he would mean that the military didn't push him out, because the military is huge. It's an extraordinary achievement. And to have had that control and maintain that power, this is no fool. So my impression is that he truly is in charge and he'll do what he wants. And if he feels that for posterity, it's his daughter, he will train her in the way that they probably attempted to train him. But in the end, you're the one. And as he's shown, he is the one. Apparently he had his uncle killed, who was his great mentor. He removed any possibility of people who had more authority than himself. But as much as we may disapprove of his methods as a leader, he is a very intelligent dictator and has kept the country together with very few resources. So, yeah, it's a very interesting time. I don't know what will happen. People have been saying the next generation of Korean leadership is the last, because invariably the economic situation, the social circumstances will mean some kind of internal collapse, but it hasn't happened. But I think the future for Korea will be some kind of economic reform, something along the lines of contained zones and a gradual process as the Chinese began after Deng Xiaoping. That's the only part out of this. And then some
That is assuming they go the China route. Remember, the Soviet Union collapsed and things things last until they don't. So if you don't reform, and we've seen that in history, whether it's dynasties, whether it's empires, whether it is states, eventually if you can't reform, or let's say if the circumstances move too fast, then people just fall. I mean, we are speaking precisely at the hour when Keir Starmer has announced his resignation. And so nothing is permanent. That's the only thing we know.
That's true, but if anybody earned the position to resign, it was Keir Starmer, with all due respect. But I think what you're saying is correct. The difference is, if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, it was because they couldn't hold the political and administrative fabric together to even begin to reform economically. The Chinese never let go of the levers of power until the economy had reached a next stage. Then a greater liberalism came. And having lived here for 42 years, the path between 1984 and now is just extraordinary. The loosening, the opening of society, the freedom of the individual, all these things have been just staggering, given what China was when I came in the 80s. So that's the model of North Korea, is maintain political control at all costs and entertain economic reform as you think is expedient. Will they do it? How they'll do it, I don't know.
They haven't done it yet. They haven't done it yet. That's the point. They are shorter. I just pointed out how much shorter they are already. 3 to 5 inches, 7 to 13 centimeters. They are underfed. They are undernourished. Demography isn't on their side either. They make nothing. They're reliant entirely on China sending grain and oil, as you said. So North Korea is a state fundamentally subsidized by the Chinese.
Well, no, I said 90% of its trade with China. Mm-hmm. There is subsidies for staples. The rest of the Korean economy is made by making missiles and rocket launchers and
selling them on the black market.
And fake Bitcoin sites and synthetic heroin, cocaine. I mean, even forged postage stamps once upon a time. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to their economy. Not to say it's a diverse economy, but China has stopped Korea from crashing and falling across its borders and disgorging millions of refugees. That's been its motive. It is not a client state of China. And I think also it's already survived appalling famines. It's possible that 3 million people died in the early 90s. Who knows how many people died during COVID and the related famines of not being able to distribute food. So, yeah, it's always the country that's been about to collapse, but it doesn't. I think that's the important point.
So far, it hasn't lasted that long. It's not even a century. So,
well, I think if we're talking about the scale of the economy and the nature of global sovereignty, in a period where you'd think any other system would not survive, North Korea has endured. And we look at Burma in the similar way, in Myanmar, where with great internal riches and potential natural wealth, for all its fragmentation, civil wars, its terrible juntas. I went there twice when it was possible to go. Again, extraordinary people under an appalling government. And that place is supposed to blow up, fall apart, kind of doesn't. So it's hard to know what holds a country together sometimes. But when you have regimes that have such complete power, it's amazing what they can, how they can endure. And I think, I'm not saying you're wrong and it won't fall apart. I'm just saying I don't know and I can't see where the impulses will come for a collapse or an emergence.
All right. So we've covered the past. We've covered what's going on now. We've talked about how China seeks to reassert some control in Pyongyang. They want North Korea to be less irresponsible, less provocative perhaps, and just be more amenable to Beijing, if not exactly behave as a vassal. What lies next? Get out your crystal ball, gaze into the future, and give us a few scenarios. You've given us one already, that the Kim dynasty continues and we get a Deng Xiaoping-like economic reform. What are the other scenarios?
The worst scenario is the path we're on, which is the continued collapse of the integrity and influence of the US in the Asia-Pacific region. I say that not because I'm a fan of the American empire, but America is falling back out of Asia so swiftly in terms of its ability to manage some stable status quo. So we see things like the Japanese making statements that they're now seeing Taiwan as an integral part of their own security, which is basically saying we'll defend Taiwan. Yes. We're seeing the Philippines as being prepared for conflict with China. America, people focus on Taiwan, but the Philippines are the greatest point of risk. And this is what an empire that is failing does. It pushes nations out before it as it withdraws, leaving them hoping that somehow they will ensnare the adversary from which the empire is withdrawing and that will slow down the influence of that adversary. And that's the American policy in Asia. So it's happy to see Japan wind things up. It's happy to see an increase in tension around the Philippines. It's kind of failed with with Vietnam. Vietnam is far too independent and too sensible. But in that mix, what happens to South Korea and its defense? It is very dependent upon American presence. They've already taken some of the best kit out of South Korea in terms of the THAAD missile systems, which are great defense and surveillance systems, and the Patriot missile batteries. I doubt those are going
Koreans, I know many South Koreans, and they have been deeply unhappy and highly concerned about this move. And so have the Japanese. Both the Japanese and the South Koreans actually have expressed alarm.
Yeah. So what does North Korea do in an environment where America is no longer the primal force, the dominant force, the hegemon? That will open up many, many opportunities for North Korea because it will fear conflict with South Korea less. It can play games with Japan by firing missiles across its airspace. So I think we are risking more of that because of the American shrinking in the region, which is not what China wants.
Just to stop you, you said something very important. The withdrawal of America from East Asia increases the risk of conflict triggered by North Korea.
Triggered by North Korea, yes, and also the desperation of South Korea as it sees America leaving and trying as fast as possible to go nuclear itself. So triggered by a number of events. That's why when I see Xi Jinping in Pyongyang, I'm coming more to my view that China's looking 5, 8, 15 years out. When I look at Putin's relationship with China and the way China has shaped that relationship, which they have. I mean, we had Donald Trump in Beijing, and that was interesting because it was a peer-to-peer meeting of nations. Putin didn't come as a peer. He came as a subordinate nation, no question. And he didn't get everything he wanted, nor did China, actually. But it was an interesting dynamic. So China depends upon regional stability.
You've spoken about both visits. You've spoken about the Donald Trump visit to Beijing with all his CEOs in tow. And you've also spoken about the Vladimir Putin visit. And you just said that the Trump-Xi meeting was a peer-to-peer meeting. But the Putin-Xi meeting, Xi was the dominant partner.
Yeah, definitely. So Xi will be doing what he can to ensure North Korea trades something, gets something, that it can begin to be more influenced by Beijing. There is no benefit for China to see any conflict anywhere. So people also think, China just wants Taiwan. It wants to fight anything that was Western influence in the area. China needs stability and peace in the region. That's why it's not invading Taiwan now or tomorrow or soon. That's why my greatest fear is how America will seek some kind of proxy conflict through the Philippines with China. But
the Philippines is often known as the Latin American armpit of Asia, and a lot of East Asian nations talk about its conversion to Catholicism under the Spaniards, and then the Americanization of Philippine culture under American rule, which I think 1898 is when America takes over the Philippines. And so it's in East Asia, and this includes Japan and perhaps even South Korea, there isn't much respect for the Philippines. It's a deeply corrupt and often seen as a highly irresponsible country in its own way.
I mean, it's a great tragedy that the American colonies, which they would never call colonies, and we include Philippines as that, come out in such poor state. We thought it was just the Brits, but anyone who colonizes another normally leaves them in pretty poor condition. So I put the French in there as well. Interestingly, the big exercises that have been taking place in the Philippines this year, actually over the last 3 years, massive military exercises, including Japan, the Philippines itself, South Korea. You have a major participation by Australia, of course, United States. Foolishly, my own country, New Zealand, has joined them. These are war games against China. We expect to trade with the country we're practicing war games again. And not to be left out, the French that have considerable assets in the Pacific, South Pacific, which is part of their existing empire.
They have the most assets of any European country and the biggest navy because of the Pacific Islands they own.
So they're all very worried that the American withdrawal means that their own positions are insecure. And this is the American strategy. Push these people into the face of China as we back away from China. And these raise factors for a number of countries in the region. And when we think of multipolarity and we think of its dynamics, it's very hard to forecast. I think China will try.
David, let me stop you 1 second. China has also been quite aggressive in its rhetoric since Xi Jinping came to power. The wolf warrior diplomacy has backfired. China has made claims in South China Sea. China has claims in East China Sea. China has made countries like Japan insecure. And it isn't as if the Chinese have been sinned against. They have been sinners themselves.
Is defense a sin?
Well, it's not so much the defense, it is the rhetoric. And it is the claims on other people's territory. You know, the 9-dot line is now a 10-dot line. So I'm saying there are no saints in the region.
In the situation, China, wolf warrior supremacy was foolish. And the beginning of Xi Jinping's term as belligerence was very unhelpful, no question. But China is trying to push back the encirclement that the United States has held in place since the end of the Korean War. No country would accept an effective blockade, which it is, to be activated in a moment's notice. So yes, the 9-dash line position in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, this is all about saying, pull back America, this is our sphere. So rather than see it as China behaving badly and being belligerent and inappropriate, China worked out we're strong enough now and we're going to push. And they have pushed. What's America done? It's backed off. So it's working. And the argument China makes is that Taiwan, which would have returned to China if the Chinese Revolution had not, or Civil War had not been interrupted by the Korean War, it still maintains its claim. And all this rhetoric in the West that it's a terrible thing that China is claiming Taiwan is pretty disingenuous. Most of those Western countries have legacies of colonialism, have legacies of coercing other countries. The thing that we do all acknowledge is that Taiwan has a unique and a very special evolution into openness, democracy, transparency, into an incredible industrial revolution later than others, and then into this tech revolution, the quality of education, of culture. These are very special things in Taiwan. And where I think Westerners and many Chinese feel deeply that don't disrupt that. That has to somehow be intact in whatever solution is sought. I'm confident in both places they'll find it. What I'm not confident in, as long as you have one family as a dictatorial system, running a country as North Korea is run, they have so many very specific subjective interests related to remaining in power themselves. What's good for their country, what's good for them strategically, how to alleviate pressure comes secondary to the needs of the emperor or the king. And that's where it makes it very difficult to engage for Russia or China or anyone else. And I don't know how you deal with that. Not in a nuclear age. So you've asked me a question I really can't answer. But We have to try and understand North Korea for itself, and be careful of this good guy, bad guy stuff, almost like cowboy films that we've been forced to engage in. It's childish and it's unnecessary. The West has to wake up and realize it's about 500 years behind on its homework on Asia, and stop jumping to conclusions and assumptions.
On that note, David, thank you very, very much for your time. We learned a lot. We'll have you back. Hopefully, the withdrawal of American forces won't lead to conflict. Hopefully, we get a Deng Xiaoping solution. There is economic reform, investment, jobs, economic growth, and all that good stuff. We'll see you back again very, very soon. Those of you who've liked this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. Bye for now.
Thank you, Atul. Bye-bye.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.